So much, Mac. We are really excited to be here with you all today and get to share a little bit about strengths and how it functions in complex adaptive systems. So welcome and thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. I just posted a link in the chat that you can use to read about your strengths descriptions. If you have taken your Clifton Strengths Assessment, that is going to be the full list of 34, and you can read about your top 5, just a short description of them. If you haven't taken your Strengths Assessment, I would encourage you to go ahead and pull that up and read through some of the descriptions as we're working through our conversation today to identify which 5 of those strengths most resonate with you right now. So to get started today, before we really dig into strengths, I would like to go ahead and share with you or ask you about a moment of pause. So we're all very busy people, I know, and I'm sure that this time of year is very, very crazy for you in many different ways. So what I'd like you to do for a moment is just pause and reflect. Where have you experienced joy this week? And go ahead and you can type that into the chat. Just a word or a phrase, something that has allowed you to experience joy. My example is here on screen. I love raising flowers, so I force bloom bulbs this time of year when it's not a lot of fresh life outside. I can still see life coming in. Yes, a nice home cooked meal. I agree. Hiking, yoga, time with family and dogs. Working in a 5th grade classroom. Yes, I love that. Grandkids, sunsets, absolutely. Feeling better. Jason, I'm glad you're feeling better. Eating tacos, absolutely. Wonderful. I am so glad. It sounds like you've all found little moments to find some pause and rest in busy affairs of your life. So thank you for sharing those. It's always nice to hear that. And really, that serves as a foundation for what I'm here to talk to you a little bit more about today, which is strengths. Strengths are rooted in our well-being. If we don't have spaces, even small spaces, where we can build upon our well-being and ensure that we have outlets to explore, then we can't leverage our strengths to our greatest capacity. So today, I'm really excited to get to think through with you, how are your strengths coming to play in your work, and where can you use those to continue to increase your well-being moving forward? So to get started, I am going to go ahead and transition. Oh, here, maybe, yeah. Transition. Oh, sorry, guys. My slide kind of went wonky for a moment. Let's go here. Okay. There we go. Okay. We'll dive back in here. Thanks for bearing with me there. So as we think about strengths is described in many different ways, but I like to use this quote to begin our conversation about what it looks like and how your strengths can show up for you. So this quote reads, "One should waste as little effort as possible on improving areas of low competence. It takes far more energy to improve from incompetence to mediocrity than it takes to improve from first-rate performance to excellence." So I'd like you to share either in the chat or you can unmute and just comment aloud. What does that quote mean to you?
It means to me that we should work on our strengths.
Absolutely. We need to work on developing our strengths. It sounds a little counterintuitive. Absolutely. So it can seem a little bit odd to hear that. How can you live in a world where you're only focusing on exceeding or making your first-rate performance? That's great, but it's often a question that arises is, but I can't do that all the time. And ultimately, strengths is focused on finding the spaces where we can maximize our performance on things we're good at, but also use those things to manage the areas where we may not have as high of competence. I love that, starting where you can see growth, and really overcoming that bubble, starting small and working up. Great descriptions. So that's what we're going to think about today in terms of strengths philosophy. I'm going to give you just a quick overview of kind of the roots of strengths before we dive in to talk about our own strengths. So, strengths philosophy is rooted in positive psychology, and kind of the founding father of the strengths philosophy is Don Clifton. He was a veteran in World War II, and came back from war and decided that he was done fighting and wanted to study human development. So he went to school, and as he was studying and doing psychological research, he found that a lot of the books he was reading were focused on what was wrong with people and how to fix it. And he said, what if we're not focusing on the right things? What would happen if instead we focused on what was right with people and how to capitalize on that more? And with that question, he began the strengths movement. He took our conventional approach to personal development that many of you are probably very familiar with, where we identify our improvement areas, our weaknesses, and we make a plan to get better at them, which ultimately isn't always a bad thing. But with that in mind, Don Clifton said, okay, what if we changed our focus and instead we shifted to identifying our talents? And as we identify our talents, we can make plans to capitalize on those, to build our knowledge and skills that allow us to develop them into our greatest strengths. And with that in mind, he showed that fixing our weaknesses, yes, it prevents failure, but when we focus on our strengths and most of our energy goes there, we can excel in more areas. So with that in mind, they developed the strengths philosophy. Now, to illustrate this a little more clearly, or to give you a little more concrete picture, I'm going to use my dad as an example. And he did give me permission and sent me his picture to share. So this is a picture of my dad along with his 7th grade report card. And so what I'd like you to shout out either aloud or in the chat is what questions come to mind immediately when you see my dad's report card. Oh, sorry. The outlier. Oh, he's good in science. Why do some have a plus and others don't? Maybe he's a socially studies person. Did he like his math teacher? Did he really despise math? He's great in science. I love this. You guys clearly have a really good grasp of the roots of the strengths philosophy right here in the questions that you're asking. Often the first question that comes up is, oh my gosh, what happened in math class? Because we tend to focus on deficits. We tend to focus on the things that are wrong and we want to fix them. So when he took his report card home, his mom asked him, what happened in math? That was the first question. Instead, what he really wanted to be asked is what you guys were asking. Wow, did you really like science, or were you great in social studies? And what did you do that made you get an A+? But often that's not our initial approach. Now, strengths is oriented towards thinking, how can we use that asset-based approach rather than focusing on the negatives? Because when we start a conversation with the assets, it also makes it easier for us to then bring up the questions about, okay, what do we need to do to help build on that D that you got in math? How could you plug in the skills you used in social studies or science in that math area as well? So that is kind of the roots of strengths philosophy. Now, with that in mind, Don Clifton and a huge team of researchers completed over 50, now 60 years of research on the natural talents that people have and the ways that we can capitalize on them in our lives. And through that research, they were able to classify lots of different smaller talents into 34 strengths themes. And that's what was in the document that I shared up at the start of the chat. And if you haven't gotten to access that, please feel free to click on it and check it out. But the 34 themes of talent measured by Clifton Strengths are listed there. When you take the strengths assessment, you get your top 5. Those are the themes that you function out of most regularly. And your strengths are very unique to you. So with strengths, I always find it interesting to think about some of the statistics around them. There are almost 300,000 possible combinations of top 5 strengths. And there's over 33 million different permutations, meaning that if you were looking for someone with the same top 5 strengths as you and in the same order, that is a 1 in 33 millionth of a chance. So your strengths are very unique. I also always like to remind people that as you are identifying your strengths, you practice all 34 of them in some capacity. Your top 5 are the ones that you practice most frequently or most naturally. Thank you, Chloe, for sharing that link again. I appreciate it. If you haven't gotten to check out that link, go ahead, and now would be a great time to click on it because we're going to start thinking about, okay, how do my strengths show up for me? So with strengths, we have 5 guiding principles that are going to guide the conversation that we're going to have in just a moment as we send you into breakout rooms. So the first guiding principle of strengths is that our strengths themes are neutral. Often strengths has a very positive association, but strengths ultimately are a neutral word. So you'll get your word and you get to give it the positive or the negative associations. They also like to emphasize that strengths themes are not labels. So this is not saying that you are an achiever, you are responsibility, but simply that that's something that influences the way that you act and the way you function. Third is that we tend to associate strengths with leading with positive intent. And that's what we like to use to guide our conversation. So assuming that the people you're interacting with, the people you're working with on teams are leading with positive intent and their strengths in mind is a goal. Fourth, differences are advantages. This is really valuable, especially when talking with people who have different strengths than you, and recognizing that everyone brings something new to the table. And then fifth, that people need one another. We have our core strengths for a reason, and often instead of having to practice the strengths that aren't as natural to us, we want to lean into people who can also use their strengths at their maximum capacity. So to explore what strengths mean and what they look like for you, we are going to do an activity where you get to name, claim, and aim your strengths. So they just shared in the chat the link to view all 34 strengths. If you've identified your top 5, you can read your strengths descriptor there. You can also log in at ksu.my.gallup.com to view your top 5 as well. If you haven't taken your Clifton Strengths Assessment, you can still participate in this activity. I'll just ask you to click on that link in the chat and skim through the descriptions of all 34 strengths and pick out the 5 that resonate most with you. When we send you into breakout rooms for this activity, what I'd like you to do is to explore what your strengths look like and how they show up for you. And we'll do that in a 3-step process. First, you'll introduce yourself to your group of 3 people that are in your group. You'll also introduce your name and your top 5 strengths. Then the other people in your group are going to choose one of the strengths that you list that they want to learn more about. So for example, my top 5 are achiever, responsibility, futuristic, strategic, and learner. If Murray was in my group, he would get to choose which strength he wanted to learn about. Maybe he wanted to hear about responsibility. Then I would say, okay, Gallup's definition of responsibility is, and when I say Gallup's definition, that's the one you can find on the page with that link. So you'll read that definition aloud, and then you get to give an example of how that strength shows up in your life. I would give an example of how responsibility shows up in my life or where I've practiced that strength. Some people don't always associate as much with Gallup's definition, and that's okay. You get to define how your strength shows up, which is why we use that aim piece to let you describe it. So that's your goal in your group of 3. Then you'll go to the next person in your group and repeat the same process. We'll give you about 3 minutes to do that with your first group. Then we'll come back together and we'll immediately send you into a second breakout group where you'll repeat that process again. So you'll get to have a conversation about your strengths with two different groups that are joining us today. Mac, do you have those breakout rooms made there? All right, I will let you go ahead and send folks into those breakout rooms. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for taking that time. I know it is so hard to fit everyone into the 3-minute time frame, so thanks for doing as much conversation as you can. And I love that you were speaking to those stories in really powerful ways. So as you think about the exercise we just did, I'd like you to either share in the chat or shout out aloud, what was the value in these conversations? What did you take away? Absolutely. Learning from others' experiences, the good qualities of others, positive traits, seeing how others view their strengths. We have specific strengths and thinking about your own. Absolutely. Oh, I love that. Influencing people's actions. Sure. You guys are highlighting a ton of really great takeaways. And that is the goal of this conversation, is to help you start thinking about, one, what are your own strengths and how do you perceive them? As well as how do others perceive their strengths? It's sometimes neat to engage in a conversation where someone has the same strength as you, but it shows up in different ways. And you can recognize that, as well as the people who have different strengths than you and how you might want to rely on them or how you might need someone with those strengths in certain situations. Thanks for that description, those descriptions there. Lots of passions that appeared and unique traits. Wonderful. So as we think about how your strengths show up and as you continue to reflect on that, you can think about them in a couple of different ways, but the ways that we develop a strength that Gallup has identified are we take our talents, and our talents are those natural ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving, the things that we just do without having to think a lot about it. But they say those aren't enough to just become a strength. You have to invest in your talents. So you take the time you spend practicing, the skills you develop, and the knowledge that you have about your strength and the things you do well. And when you multiply those together and you practice your talents and develop skills around them, that is what yields your strengths, the ability to provide more perfect performance on a consistent basis. So that is what those strengths are. The reason that you have your top 5 is because those are the ones that you've probably invested in, whether you knew it or not, and are naturally repeating in your daily lifestyles. So I'd encourage you to reflect on that as we move forward. And I'm going to hand it over to Murray to start thinking about, okay, how do these strengths appear in bigger contexts?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to have this few minutes this afternoon to talk to you a little bit more about strengths, but maybe placing this, I usually call it scaling it up, to say, what does this look like within maybe a team environment as well as a systems environment or through a systems lens. And I do like what one of the comments, Kelechi, I think said that our strengths also influence the actions of others. And that's how I'm going to approach this through a leadership lens. And so I want to ask you this question really quickly. Well, let me give you this survey first. So Gallup asked 1.7 million employees from over 100 companies in over 60 countries, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best, to play to your strengths every day? I want to hear from you all. What do you think the percentage of people that responded positively? So how many people out of 100 do you think said they do have that opportunity to do what they do best, to play to their strengths every day? Go ahead and put that in the chat box.
5%, 35%. 7.8. That's some very specific numbers. 40%.
Good. Yeah, some of you, several of you have hit the number exactly. Some of you seem to be optimistic. Others have very low numbers. The percentage they came up with when they conducted this survey was 20%. So that means only 1 in 5 people would answer that question positively, that they have the opportunity to do their best, to play to their strengths every day. Now, I want to kind of show you a couple of other numbers. There are lots of surveys on this that focus on employee satisfaction and things of that nature. Many organizations that do it. Here's some that I pretty much pulled at random just to kind of illustrate this point. 59% of the world's employees are not engaged. That was from a Gallup survey. 49% feel that their organization isn't delivering on the experience they promised. That's half of everybody. Low engagement costs the global economy almost $9 trillion a year. 59% of workers are experiencing at least moderate burnout. So these are all trends maybe, or maybe we would call them patterns that we see in professional circles today, in organizations and across systems today. Very, very common to see statistics like this. And I hate to say that it seems like they're even getting worse, but at least that does seem like something that is happening. I do want to highlight one though, and it's in the upper right. Employees who report having a positive employee experience are 16 times more engaged than employees with a negative experience. Honestly, like I don't even know what 16 times more engaged looks like, but that seems like a lot. And I think when I look at this through a leadership lens, it makes me think of a couple of things. I know in a lot of studies that look at this, the leader has a huge impact on what that employee engagement and experience looks like, so that sometimes they'll call it a mitigating factor, depending on how engaged the leader is, influences that kind of employee satisfaction. But there's also an element that reverberates through a broader system. And I want to talk about that a little bit today. And I'm going to use this little graphic to just very simply illustrate what a complex adaptive system is. So when we use the term complex adaptive systems, what are we talking about? And it's, I'll walk us through this very quickly, but it is very much just a perspective on how we can identify patterns within a broader systems that we navigate on a daily basis, which that could, be our organization, but it could be something beyond that organization. And generally, we would think of a system as beyond the organizational level, but yet some of these patterns do reverberate beyond that organizational level, and how identifying those patterns can give us some direction in how we can engage others and act in a leadership capacity. So the first kind of step here is we would say agent interactions generate patterns. So we are all agents, right? The individuals interacting and relating to each other and negotiating difference and doing all that sort of thing is how we are interacting. These patterns are human patterns, right? Things that we observe across a human population. And that's the product of those human interactions, those agent interactions. A quick note on the patterns, that we're not really talking about cause and effect. So it's not really something where you could say, I'm going to engage, Katie, for instance, in a certain way and expect the result to be a systemic pattern. That would not be realistic. They're not linear necessarily, and they constantly change. The patterns that we see are constantly shifting. We can't control or predict those patterns. These are all aspects of kind of systems thinking and complexity thinking. However, we can influence how we engage other actors. So let me, another point on the patterns. What are these patterns that I'm talking about? Well, they can be a lot of different things, but I think we would say that shared attitudes, mental models, traditions, expectations across the community or fears, collective behaviors. Those are all things that we would call system-wide patterns. They're things that you can see outside of a single individual, but that are noticeable. I'm going to give you a concrete example of this in a second. I just want to walk through this cycle really quickly. Whoops. So one thing to note in these patterns, that if you can recognize the patterns, that can enable you to influence your future interactions. And perhaps if you're in a leadership capacity, or if you're acting in a leadership capacity, that you can influence others, and through that influence, you can help shift those patterns. So how do we do it? Here's a very nice 5-step process that is really just kind of a conceptual thing to help us understand it. So identifying the pattern is key. Where's the tension in that pattern? How do interactions contribute to that tension? And then how do we engage with others to shift the tension? And then I love number 5, see what happens. And that's really a big aspect. That uncertainty is a big aspect of systems thinking, because we don't control and predict the patterns. We don't know what the outcome will necessarily be. All we can really do is decide how we want to engage others. So what's an example what does this look like in real life? Before coming to Kansas State and before coming to academia, I spent over 20 years largely in leadership positions with different organizations. A huge chunk of my time was spent in the FBI. And for most of that time, I was in formal leadership roles within the FBI. FBI work by its nature is interagency. So there's the perspective that any agent that is hired for the FBI is expected to be a leader, because they're going to need to engage in an interagency environment. And so I was often, when I was in a leadership capacity, I was kind of the leader of leaders. And so when we look back to how that individual behavior can be influential, when that leader is leading leaders, now all of a sudden that behavior gets perhaps even more important in influencing what kind of patterns result. In one time in my job, I was assigned to go to an office in West Virginia. West Virginia is a very rural part of the US, for those of you not familiar. The southern part is dominated by coal mines still, which many are defunct and not in operation anymore. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of opioid abuse. And I went there because it's kind of ground zero for the opioid crisis in the United States. And when I went there, I expected to have this really engaged team, and that we could put together some great cases and really try to make some progress on a really difficult challenge. But what I encountered was a culture of employees that were very dissatisfied, and that they didn't want to engage, and they didn't want to try to make progress on something that was really difficult. I was even told before I reported that I had one individual I was going to need to fire as soon as I got there. And so that person's behavior was kind of a product of this very negative culture. When I got there, I started kind of talking to people in the office and within the system, so within the other agencies that they interacted with. And I found that pattern of dissatisfaction, and sometimes it would manifest in very negative groupthink, was prominent throughout the culture. So what did I do to address it? We're going to get back into the strengths philosophy. So we had a systemic pattern that was negative in this circumstance, and it reflected what we saw in those statistics from the various surveys. So how can I start to kind of shift that pattern? That kind of becomes the question. Sometimes it seems impossible to change a company culture, but we know that it isn't, because people are able to do that. And so through strengths thinking, we can look at some 4 areas of what we call domains of team strengths. And maybe this is kind of a helpful way to organize our thoughts around what this could look like at a team level and even beyond. We have 4 areas. Basically, they are executing, relationship building, systems thinking, or strategic thinking, and influencing. So all the strengths that you have just shared and talked about fall within one of these four domains, one of these four categories. And when we talk about at the team level, so here they all are. One question I might ask you is, if you have a lot of strengths in one specific area, is it always useful to engage other people that have the same domain of strengths as yourself? Maybe it's kind of a rhetorical question. But one thing strength science kind of teaches us is that it's useful to balance, to find balance. So my strengths are very heavily in two categories: strategic thinking and the next one of mine, which is influencing. Strategic thinking keeps the team focused on what could be, constantly analyzing information and helping the team make good decisions. So that's one of my strengths. Another one of my strengths is here in the influencing category. Influencers help their team reach a broader audience. They will speak up and make sure their team is heard. So when I went into this environment where I was facing this negative culture, though I wasn't versed in Clifton strengths at the time, I had taken other assessments, and I knew just from my past leadership experience that I had a strength for strategic thinking. So instead of trying to patch relationships, which is not one of my strengths, I decided to take an approach that allowed me to lean into my strengths. I created a strategic plan that allowed me to kind of help shift the culture. One thing I noted was that many of the employees felt that our office was ignored and disregarded by the rest of our organization. The FBI is a global organization. Charleston, West Virginia is not the top of the priority list. And yet we would get strategic plans pushed down from, our bosses in Washington, D.C. that didn't reflect the area that we were working in. And that was frustrating to people that worked in that environment over years. I also found that partner agencies, the DEA, Homeland Security, a variety of others that we work with routinely, had a very similar experience. So one thing that I did, knowing that strategic thinking was one of my strengths, was develop a strategic plan that was very specific to Charleston, West Virginia, and the problems that we were confronting. I used my influence, so my influencer strengths, to engage other agencies and to talk about it in a way that other people could get on board. And maybe we could not only be more productive, but also shift this cultural challenge that we were dealing with. That was kind of the way I approached it. I was leaning into my strengths. Well, one thing I realized very, very quickly was that I was not going to be effective because I needed two more things that I don't have a preference for. I was not an executor. What does that mean for me? I was not a details person. I had the vision, but how to actually execute it, that was not my strength. You see over here, we have consistency, discipline, focus, not really my thing. And so I looked within my team to see who could actually fill that role. I found a couple of people that were extremely detail-oriented and very good at laying out a process to bring that vision a reality. So instead of trying to do that myself, where that wasn't my strength, I was able to lean into those partners to allow them to put that plan together. The other thing that I actually stumbled on quite a bit at first was in that relationship building area, because again, that's not one of my strengths. I often would go to other partners where I kind of felt like they needed to make the same shift I was. And I would immediately jump into, hey, here's my plan, sometimes without really building the appropriate relationship. And so after having several failures from taking that approach, I looked within my team again and I said, well, who are the people that are really good about building relationships? And I had a couple of people one was from New York, extremely charismatic guy. I don't know that honestly he could do investigations or anything like that, but he was charismatic. And I started bringing him with me to these meetings. And immediately within minutes, he would have this solid relationship with someone that would then allow me to lean into my strategic thinking strength and start to deploy my plan. It was effective, you know, and again, could I say that this action and kind of designing this team in a way to kind of help shift a pattern, was the shifted pattern that I saw a result of this action? I can't say that. That's not really how patterns work in complex adaptive systems. However, I could say that it had a positive influence within the system in which we were operating, and it allowed the collection of agencies that work together on a really challenging problem to come together in ways that I hadn't witnessed previously. So I want to just kind of have a second of reflection. Based on your dominant strengths domain, what do you offer to a team? Like, what can you do that maybe other people might struggle with that would be valuable in a team setting? And just like I described, are there things you need from a team because it's not something that is actually a strength of yours, much like relationship building and executing are not strengths of mine? So just take a second to kind of reflect on that as you've discussed your strengths earlier and as you're processing this from kind of a domain perspective. So I want to talk about kind of one other aspect. So we've talked kind of about complex adaptive systems and how leaning into our strengths, especially with our team supporting our areas of not strengths, can help kind of create a positive influence that can, influence a broader pattern. I want to talk very quickly about one study. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. There's another aspect of strengths that, like Katie talked about, Clifton's strengths are not really how we think about strengths versus weaknesses. It's more preferences that we have. And there are positive manifestations of that preference, and there's negative manifestations of that preference. But I want to talk about a study really quickly that kind of shows the difference between the influence of modeling positive behavior versus modeling negative behavior. You know, a lot of the statistics that we saw earlier certainly were the product of people modeling kind of negative behavior and how that could spread at the systems level and become a pattern. But positive patterns are more powerful. There was a study conducted a number of years ago in a Midwest city that involved cutting in line at movie theaters. So this is just a little video of a line, but they conducted this study at a big movie theater on like a Friday night when the lines for, the new movies was extremely long. And they ran the study 3 different ways. Initially, and this was done in a Midwest city, so very much like Manhattan, Kansas, probably a bigger city, but in this area. And they ran the study 3 ways. The first thing they did was they had one of the researchers would literally just walk up and cut in line waiting for the movie. Didn't say anything to anyone, just stepped in line in front of somebody. Now, in a Midwestern city, how many people do you think, or how often do you think someone engaged that person that cut in line? What percentage? All right, a couple of zeros. 80% gentry, nice. Yeah. Got a couple higher numbers. I will tell you, in this particular study, it was pretty close to 0%. So almost nobody engaged the line cutter. So they ran the experiment a second time and they changed it. This time they put an actor in the line towards the back of the line. And then they did the same thing. They had somebody come up and cut in line. This time, though, the actor leaned out and said, "Hey, what are you doing, jerk? Get to the back of the line. We're all waiting here." And the person would then step out of line and go to the back of the line. About 10 minutes later, they had in the exact same line, they had another researcher go and cut in line again. So after observing that kind of interaction, how many times out of 100 do you think somebody else in line, after viewing that behavior, then engaged the line cutter? So this could be a product of where this study was conducted in the Midwest. I'll tell you that after observing the negative behavior, almost 0% of people mimicked that behavior and yelled at the line cutter. So they did it one more time. And this time what they did was exact same as the second time. But when the actor leaned out to engage the line cutter, they were very polite. And they said, "I'm sorry, sir. Maybe you weren't aware, but we've all been waiting in line for quite a while. The back of the line's right over here. It probably won't delay you very much getting into the movie. So if you don't mind." And that was the behavior that was modeled. So 10 minutes later, they ran another researcher into the same line as a line cutter. Now, when they witness positive behavior, how many times out of 100 do you think somebody else in the line then engaged the line cutter after witnessing that? Yeah. It was actually about 85%. So I think it's funny, someone mentioned New Yorkers. I actually did talk about this study in New Jersey with a bunch of New Jersey cops. And when I talked about engaging the line cutter, everyone was like, 100%. I'm gonna, yell at that jerk to get out of line. So I think it really depends on who you're talking to, but in the Midwest, being very nice, this is kind of what the pattern looked like. But I think the important point is to realize that those patterns reverberate. And if you demonstrate positive behavior, that is going to be much more likely to be mimicked than if you're demonstrating negative behavior. So one thing that you're going to have the chance to look at, and I don't think, how much time do we have left? Okay. We'll share a document with you called The Basements and Balconies. And so I want you to take a look at this regarding your top 5 strengths. In the basements and balconies, because these are preferences, there is a positive manifestation and kind of a negative manifestation of that strength. Here's one of mine. I don't know if any of you have Activator, but you can see when you're on the balcony or when you're engaged in a positive way with that particular strength, it can be, being fired up, engaging others, sparking interest in others, bold, courageous. But on the negative side, it can be ready, fire, aim, meaning you're acting before planning, maybe. You can leave others feeling lost, not thinking things through. When I look at my strengths and the way I manifest Activator, I actually identify more with the basement side. I feel like this is more characteristic of me than that positive side. So if this is how I'm manifesting and this is how I'm leaning into my strength, that can look like probably negative behavior among a group of people. So one way we talk about the strengths is that we often have a way to balance that out. So another one of my strengths is input. In fact, input is my #1 strength. And if I'm recognizing that I have this negative tendency to do things without planning, acting without proper preparation, maybe I can lean into that input side of my strengths, which favors things like being well-informed, collecting interesting things, being a good conversationalist. Those are things that might slow me down, ask for feedback from other people, and help me engage in a way that might prevent me from acting rashly, which might be my tendency. So one thing I would kind of leave you with is your behavior acting in a leadership capacity can reverberate out. Not only does it affect the team that you're trying to lead, whether it's in a formal or informal leadership role, but it can have reverberations beyond that and influence a system. The greater your influence is, the more that might affect other people and how other actors engage each other. So leaning into your strengths can be a really useful tool to understanding how to influence those kind of higher level dynamics. Now, I think we have like a couple minutes left. Does anyone have any questions or anything that Katie and I can address before we hand it back over to Mac for some final comments?
I do have a question.
Yes, sir.
So, although productive in some environments, some strengths tend to be more recognized, especially in a competitive environment, competitive work environment. Some strengths tend to be more quickly recognized than others, right? So what would be your recommendation for someone whose strength, maybe empathy, such kind of strengths that are not readily seen as, they are not measured in the workplace in terms of output, but in long term, they are pretty productive. So what would you recommend for such kind of scenario?
That's a super tough question. Do you have any thoughts, Katie?
Something that we,
Oh, hang on, sorry.
I don't know, I can probably talk in something that we often highlight in our conversations about strengths are moments of excellence. And so I would encourage you to think about, where do I experience, maybe I'll talk and you'll hear me through one of the speakers. Where do we experience moments of excellence using that strength, and where can we leverage those? And when you can speak to those to your employers and bring that language into conversation as a valuable component of how you work, that can be a really powerful way to kind of make your strength visible to others. And also then asking your colleagues about, hey, where have you been thriving at? Where have been some of your moments of excellence? So they also can then think about, what am I doing that maybe isn't necessarily being recognized as overtly?
I also think that your question, especially mentioning empathy, reminds me of an experience I had when I was doing a course for the Buenos Aires City Police in Argentina. I had a high-level female police leader who probably had 500 people under her, who commented that she's got a lot of empathy and that she can show empathy to her subordinates and they love her for it. But at times when she's engaging coworkers and leaders, her leaders, many of whom are men, right? A male police agency, male-dominated environment, her empathy can be more of a hindrance. And I think, I do think that's kind of something to recognize is there a time and a place and with certain groups that you would get more out of leaning into that strength than others? And I think the way she kind of said it was, it's not that I can't be empathetic, but I just have to kind of recognize that my tendency towards empathy might be better served when I'm engaging subordinates than engaging my superiors. I do think when you're talking about competitive environments, that is something that has to be negotiated, because competition can be something valuable if you're in a competitive environment, but it can also be very divisive within a team. And so it might be a matter of how are you fostering that discussion, and in what areas of the system in which you operate is that a valuable tool, and at which places is that less valuable? I think we have another question, right?
Yeah, we have a couple here. Bridget, could you clarify, are you thinking suggestions on moving from basement to balcony without overwhelming yourself or without overwhelming others?
Both. Like, how do you do it for yourself, and then in turn take that and translate that to others to help lead them to do the same without everybody, freaking out?
That is also a very challenging question and a challenging thing to do. And I think bringing your strengths into conversation and building kind of a strengths-oriented, asset-based approach to your conversations with your teams is really valuable, so that you can help clarify that a little more explicitly. I also think that in my personal experiences, I know that sometimes I haven't always recognized when I was functioning from a basement of my strength, or that my colleagues were interpreting my actions as a basement of my strength. So doing more research personally on my basements and balconies has allowed me to kind of key into that and consider my strengths from multiple perspectives as well, which is helpful.
Yeah, I think that reflection piece is absolutely critical to being effective here, and not thinking of your strengths as what you want them to be, but what are they actually? What do your preferences actually look like? And that reflection can take a while, I think, to really sink in and to find value. I'll say the first time I took my strengths assessment, I had a hard time really finding a ton of value in it, but the more that I've researched it and reflected on my actual behavior, the more valuable I've found it. Thank you all so much for your engagement. It's been a great hour. I hope you are taking away a couple of things that can be useful for you as you move forward. I know Mac wanted to have the last word, so I want to pass it back to Mac for some final announcements.
All right, thank you very much again to Katie and Murray for this workshop. Before you all head out, I just have a couple of announcements to share. So we will send out an email to everyone who registered that'll have a link to the recording for today's session, as well as those additional resources that Murray and Katie shared. The recording will also be posted on the Grad Edge Canvas page, so you can look for it there. Also, as a reminder, we have our next Leading Change workshop this upcoming Tuesday, March 5th from 2 to 3:30. So recognize that that is an hour and a half as opposed to an hour. Hopefully you've got that scheduled appropriately. If you have not yet registered, you can still do that on the graduate school's website. And that'll be a session about leadership coaching facilitated by Dr. Andrew Weefald and Shaquila Harrison. For those of you who are participating in the Grad Edge program, please remember to submit your documentation of learning in Canvas. That'll be due by Tuesday, March 5th as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And thank you again for all attending, and to Murray and Katie for facilitating. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.